Good morning. It's great to be here today. And Meredith, thank you for those kind words, but I will be honest, and my feelings aren't hurt. I know none of that matters to you. Because you're here for one thing, and that's to win more projects. And that's what I want to help you do, is win more projects, and that's what the Pursuit Coach is all about. So what we're going to talk about today is the invisible side of business development. And to do that, we need to start with some physics and some astrophysics. We're going to start with a quiz. Nobody panic. There's 4 fundamental forces in nature. Who remembers what they are? Here's the 4 forces. Strong force, weak force, and you know they came up with these a long time ago because the names aren't creative. Strong force, weak force, electromagnetic force, and gravitational force. But now, if you watch Nova like I do with my kids on a regular basis, there's a 5th force out there that physicists have come up with. They don't really understand it or how it works, but that's dark matter. All they know is it's out there, it surrounds everything, it seems to impact everything, but you can't really find it unless you know how to look for it. Now, I've taken that and I've applied that to a business development context. Now, who can tell me, or what are your ideas, what are the 4 fundamental forces in business development? Proposals, interviews, client meetings, and phone calls. These are the places that we interact with clients. These are places where we touch base with them, where we have an opportunity to sway, influence, and get them to see that our idea is the best. Now, just like our astrophysics example, there's a 5th force. Now, who can guess what that is? That's right, rapport. It's the dark matter of the business development universe. It's everywhere, it surrounds everything, it impacts everything, but unless you know what to look for, it's very hard to see. But that's not going to be the case by the time we're done here. We're going to know how to see rapport, how to develop rapport, how to use that rapport to the best of your advantage with sincerity and integrity, and I'll say that over and over again throughout this presentation, and how to win more projects with rapport without hammering away on our technical capabilities. Influence. This is what ultimately I believe we want with our clients. We want to be able to influence their decision process, their views of the project, and influence them to believe that our approach is the best approach to solving their problem. Now, what determines our influence with a client? I'm not going to let you off the hook on this one. Somebody throw out an idea. What's that? Expertise. Past experience. Trust. Good communication. All right. This is what I think it is. Technical expertise and rapport. All those things can be boiled down to these 2. I have presented, organized, and attended hundreds of professional presentations. And the one thing I've learned during that time is unless there's an equation somewhere in the proposal, it's all fluff and it doesn't matter. So, here's our equation. This is what I call the unifying theory of business development. Just like scientists and physicists are looking for a unifying theory of the universe, luckily we're not physicists. We're consultants, and we've already got ours. It didn't take a hadron collider. We didn't have to find a God particle to figure out our unifying principle, but we have it right here. Your influence depends on your technical expertise times the rapport you have with the client. I assume you all have the technical expertise that's needed to perform in your professions as a consultant. And I'm not going to do anything to enhance that technical expertise through this presentation or this program. What I'm going to focus on is the rapport. Now, since we are trained in the technical aspects of our profession, that's our go-to. When a proposal comes out and you sit down in a group with the technical people, sometime during that meeting, usually very early on, what's the first reason that comes up for chasing that project? Exactly. We can do that. And what's the problem with that approach?
Everyone else.
Exactly. Tony, you got it. You're on a roll. Everybody else can do that project that's proposing on it. Some not as well as others, but if you're down to the last 3 or 4 consultants in a selection for the client, they all have the skills. They can all do it. So if everybody is equal in the technical expertise, what makes the difference? The rapport. And what do you hear from a client after you lose a project? If you sit down and talk to that client, somewhere during that discussion, what does the client say? Really, any of the teams could have done the project. And that is probably the truest thing you hear from a client in a debrief, is any of the teams could have done it. But what I've been tempted to ask sometimes of a client, I've never had the guts to do it, is, well, if we were all equal, did you throw all the names in a hat and pull somebody out? No. There's never a client that is taking, well, here's a top 4, let's throw them in, Bob, pull one out because you don't know anybody and we'll see who wins. They don't. So something is making a difference. There's somebody that they want to be working with. And what is that something based on? It's based on rapport. Now, we're going to go back in math. I just reviewed this myself with my son in algebra. TE and rapport are both equal. If either one of those is 0, you have no influence. If you have a value in there for your technical expertise or your rapport, it enhances the other one, so you have even more influence. So this is really what I think it all boils down to for business development. You need influence. If you have the technical expertise, we're assuming, if you don't have technical expertise in an area, what do? You go out and get it, you go out and hire somebody, but you're not going to pursue a project without the technical expertise. So you have to learn how to develop rapport, that dark matter. Now, somebody out there is thinking, what about cost? Isn't cost an influencing factor with clients? And using our astrophysics analogy here, I'll say this, no. Cost is a black hole. When a firm starts to take on a strategy of developing clients or pursuing projects based on lowest cost, you get yourselves into a downward spiral right into oblivion. You can work yourself, you can be billing 80 hours a week until you close the doors because you go bankrupt, because you're not making enough money to make any profit. And profit, profit isn't a dirty word. I had a client ask me once, like, well, you guys seem to have, such a high profit margin on here, which we didn't, but I just described it as profit is the cost of having competition. If consultants weren't making profit, there wouldn't be any competition, and soon you'd find yourself only working with one client or one consultant. That's when your prices go up. So, no, if you're saying, well, we can do this cheaper than everybody else, and you're going to the least common denominator of cost, that's not creating influence with the client. That's just sinking you into a deep hole. Because what's that client going to do next time? Or what's it going to expect next time?
Another 5%.
Another 5% off. Let's put a couple extra things on there. Well, you did it for me for that price last time. So it's not a good strategy. It's not influence. So today, it's all about rapport. How to get it, how to know when you've got it, what to do with it when you've got it, and how to know when you've lost it. And that's just as valuable as getting it in the first place. Not because when you lose it, you want to panic. When you lose it, that's a key indicator that something's not jiving with the client. You need to backtrack a little bit and come back around and try another approach. So in order to do that, we're going to talk about influencing language. How you can use some very simple language phrases based on an identifiable type of behavior that client is using to better connect with them. Metaphor and analogy. Now, I know you're sitting there thinking, well, wait, this isn't an English class. What's he talking about metaphor and analogy for? Using metaphor and analogy can really hammer home and create a link in your client's mind between your project and your solution, and can create an emotional link in your presentation. It creates, through the brain, a way for them really to remember your presentation over the facts and figures of everybody else's. Information chunking. This is how you can come to a point of agreement and then lead your client in a direction that you would like them to go. Pacing and leading. This is another way where once you establish, you pace yourself with the client until you establish rapport. And then once you have that rapport established, how you can then go in the direction that you wish to go. And then perceptual positions. Perceptual positions is a technique that you can use before a meeting or after a meeting to get a better understanding of what's coming up or how you want that meeting to go, or to debrief after that meeting and get some insight afterwards of what might have happened or what you could do different. What is rapport? And throw anything out. What do you think rapport is? When I say rapport to you, if I say, Larissa, you seem to have good rapport with Nate. What's that mean? To the group, Larissa and Nate seem to have great rapport. What does that mean? Relationship? Interaction?
Trust and confidence.
Trust and confidence. Rapport can be described as a state of mutual trust and responsiveness between individuals or groups of people. So it's kind of what you guys threw out right there, the key words. Rapport is one of the key unconscious elements of human interaction. It takes something to establish that rapport. Now, once you decide, I'm going to establish rapport with this person, the challenge is it going to be good rapport? Or after break, is this person going to move to a different seat? So everybody leave your signs where they are and we'll see what happens after the first break. We can use rapport in interpersonal communication to encourage the person we are communicating with to relax, feel a sense of familiarity and comfort in their interaction with us, and to lower the barriers of resistance to become more receptive to our communication. Now that sounds like a pretty key skill to have if we're trying to convince a client that ours is the best solution, don't you think? Is there anything in there anybody wouldn't want to have when they're sitting down with a client? No. Now, have you ever had the experience where you had instant rapport with somebody for no other reason than they just seem to be your kind of person? Somebody you've met on a plane. I met a person on a plane once where I chatted it up for 4 hours, never saw him before, never saw him after, but we just had great rapport and talked about everything. We're all familiar with these sayings: being in sync, being on the same wavelength, well, maybe not commonality of perspective. I came across that one. It sounded a little academic, but after I thought about it, it's like, yeah, I guess that's kind of what we're going for. What do these describe? Rapport. Instant rapport. So we don't even necessarily know what rapport is or how to describe rapport. We use phrases like this: wow, we really seem to be in sync. Well, when you hear that, you know you've got rapport with somebody. If you hear a client say, if you ask the question saying, you seem to be working with such and such consultant, over and over, what's that all about? Well, things are really open to all the consultants and we like the competition. Just at the past projects, we just really seem to be in sync with who not, XYZ. You hear those words, you run or pile up your resources you're going to need to overcome that. Because what they're saying is, they get us. We're on the same wavelength. We don't really know why we work well together, but it's just easy. That's what you want to develop with a client. That's what you want to be aware of if somebody else has it with a new client you're pursuing. And that's what you want to be able to identify if there's a chink in the armor of the other consultant, so we all know you can jump in and try to win that client. Here's the good news. Rapport doesn't require friendship. It doesn't require a lifelong commitment to somebody to develop that rapport. All it requires is the knowledge and the techniques to be able to develop that rapport. And in a BD setting, to be able to develop that rapport in a very narrow, short window, and then know that you've got it, recognize you've got it, and then build on it over the long term and anchor it in and make it even stronger. Right now, somebody's thinking this probably. Isn't knowingly attempting to develop rapport just manipulation? That depends on you. You can use it in a manipulative style. You're free to do that. You can take the tools that I give you here today and you can use those for nefarious means and really try to manipulate your client. Or you can use them with sincerity and integrity to make it a two-way street and a win-win with your clients. If you choose the other path, this is what you get. It will blow up in your face. If you were at point 0 when you attempted to develop that rapport, and you were trying to manipulate, and this blows up, you might as well write that client off, because you have just sacrificed your integrity and your trust with that client. And to be quite honest, I have no ideas or solutions as to how to rebuild that unless there's turnover at that client's organization. It's that important. My objective for you is to make this as easy as possible. I know that you're in a technical field because you enjoy being in a technical field. That's what you enjoy doing. BD is something that you're moving into your career where you have to be doing better, but your love is BD. If you wanted, or your love is the technical work. If you wanted to be doing BD, you would have gone to business school. So I want to make it simple for you to use. So here's a little secret of rapport. Very little of rapport building has anything to do with what you say. And what I'm going to teach you today is you can establish that rapport without saying a word. Now, you are going to speak when you use these techniques, but what you are doing to develop that rapport isn't what you're saying. If you want rapport and influence, what you need to do is be quiet and listen. That's what's going to help to establish rapport and trust with that client. Now, I've got an example of this. Over the last 8 years, there's 2 particular recruiters that have made regular phone calls to me. One of them, great guy, calls me up. We talk for 10, 15 minutes, get the lowdown on things. He fills me in on the state of the industry up here. We have some laughs, we chat, we exchange information, we're off the phone. It's even gotten to the point where sometimes if I hadn't heard from him in a while, I would give him a call and say, hey, what's going on? Just to talk. So he had actually established a level of rapport with me that I was happy to call him. Now there's another guy that had a completely different approach. He'd call me every 6 weeks, and he had the same 3 stories. And as soon as I said hello, tells me about how wonderful he is, everything that he's done for everybody else, and really never got around to what he could do for me, his, in that setting, half of his clients. And he would talk nonstop for 40 to 45 minutes with me saying nothing more than, I'd put him on speakerphone and go on to other things. And he would go on about everything that he could do and what he has done in the past, and never getting around to how that was going to help me. Never listened, never asked me, are you even looking for a job, Brian? So rapport, it's about being quiet and listening. So what I want to show you here is what rapport looks like. And what I say what it looks like is because this is what you can do without ever having to say a word with a client to establish rapport. Now I'm going to go through some photos here. Jot down some notes, some similarities you see throughout these photos, okay? Here's the first one. Some of them are staged photos, some of them are real photos, but they all demonstrate the same thing. And this last one is actually one of my favorites because it shows that rapport doesn't equal proximity. You've got this guy in the middle who's in rapport with the woman next to him, but absolutely has zero rapport with the gentleman on the other side of him. So based on what I just said there, what do you think one of the keys to developing rapport is? What's that?
Mimicry?
Break those up because you're on the right track.
Common body language.
Common body language, yes. And we're going to talk about how there's a good side to that and bad side to that in just a minute. What else? What about that? What kind of common body language did you see here?
Eye contact.
Eye contact. I'm going to give you an example of that and why that can be good and bad in just a minute here. What else?
Leaning forward.
Leaning forward when? When they do. It's, yes, matching. That's the key word. One of the keys to rapport building is matching the other person. Now, there's one other thing here too. If this was person one and this was person two, where was their point of focus when they were in rapport?
On each other.
No?
Same thing.
It was out here somewhere. If you looked at it, in fact, I'll do this example right now. Pick a person right next to you and then take your chairs and I want you to turn your chairs and sit knee to knee. Now, I want you to look directly at that other person. Strong eye contact, right at him. Now, who feels uncomfortable doing that? Raise your hand high. Okay, now, take your chairs and turn them at a 45-degree angle, my direction. Now, how's that? That's where you all went initially. That's where you were comfortable. And now, so when you're doing that, where's your point of focus? It's right out here somewhere. You can talk to one another, but it's not that head-on. And why is that? What does that eye-to-eye contact communicate?
Aggression.
Aggression, threat. And that's something to keep in mind working in an industry of engineering, which is still predominantly men. And you sit down across the table and you have this meeting, that's an aggressive stance. So your message isn't going to get across. You've broken rapport right there. What you can do is simply turn that way. 45 degrees, everybody's comfortable, everybody can talk. Those things that we've talked about rapport. People have relaxed, they've become responsive, they'll open up, they'll stretch out, they'll get relaxed. Now that's the first step, is basic body matching. You saw in all those photographs, they had similar posture. They were taking on with the person next to them. Now what will happen is after you've talked to a client for a while, it may not be the first meeting, it may not be the second meeting, but as it goes on, you can actually find that if you match the client's posture and then you move out of sync, if there's rapport established there, you can get the other person now to move to your posture. And when they do that, you know you've started to create some rapport there. If you use this with integrity and sincerity, everything goes great. If you don't, this happens again. And again, it's not a coincidence that I'm repeating this. It's very, very important because people will go out and use these tools in the wrong manner. So if you can't find a way to establish rapport and good rapport with sincerity and integrity with a client, find someone else in the office who can. You don't have to be the bringer of all business. Your job is to determine if you can establish rapport with that person, and if you can't, put your ego in a drawer and find someone who did or who can. I had an example of this in my own career as well. There was a gentleman who worked his way up through the utility until he was now utility director. He saw me as some college guy with a blazer, and we had nothing in common. We were cordial to one another, but it just wasn't meshing. So finally I said, this just isn't working, is it? He said, no, it's not. He said, Brian, you're a nice enough guy, but we don't have anything in common. And I tried all the tools we'll talk about today. I said, you know what? I agree completely. There's a guy in the office here that I want you to meet and see what you think. They sat down and, hey, they hit it off in one meeting. If you're feeling it, they're feeling it too. And if you guys are both feeling it, you're frustrated and they're frustrated because you're wasting their time because they know they're not going to work with you anyway. So find somebody who can hook up with that person and work with them. Now, here's a bonus equation. You guys didn't see that coming, did you? If rapport is equal to sincerity times our effort, then what's that do to our equation? Our influence is equal to our technical expertise times our sincerity times our effort. If you have sincerity, if you really enjoy going and meeting this person and talking to this person and genuinely enjoy the interaction with them, but you only do it once every 9 months, what happens to your rapport? It never has a chance to develop. On the flip side, you might call this person every other week and just put in tons of effort, take them to dinners, make sure you run into them at conferences. But if you're just doing it in something that comes across as checking the box, what's your sincerity level there? It's 0. So that wipes out our entire equation again. There was one point in my career where I was working with a national firm, and in business development training, one of the tips they gave to people when they walked into a client's office for the first time was to quickly scan the office, look around, find something that's of obvious interest to the client, and strike up a conversation around that. Now, typically, this was very, very poorly executed. I was like, wow, I see you like dog sledding. I do. What do you know about dog sledding, Brian? Absolutely nothing. And it looked bad. What did that do to your equation? What fell out there? What went to 0 when I admit I knew nothing about dog sled racing? My sincerity. Well, unless I was trying to get them a dog sledding contract, then it would have been technical expertise. But in this case, it's sincerity. I'm just trying to go pick something out. That falls under the realm of manipulation. I was trying to, or not, I wasn't, but the practice was, in my opinion, to manipulate the client to try and draw them into some false conversation around a topic that they liked. It's just a simple conversation. And when you sit down with a client, and we're going to talk about the difference between matching and mirroring here in a minute. When you sit down with a client, I'm not saying take on their exact posture, but slowly move in that direction. Just through simple introductions, how you doing, matching that body posture, you begin to create an environment of rapport. Is this what you want? That's an example of mirroring, and it's not what you want. And believe it or not, I have seen people that so poorly execute the matching that it looks like this. Now, can you imagine what that does to a client if you're matching their emotions, movement for movement? So, I can already see there's people taking on similar postures. And your focus being out here. Now, without even knowing it, there's rapport developing in the group. And that's how groups take on their own dynamic, is rapport develops in the group outside of the speaker. We talked about the matching and the body posture and what rapport looks like when you have it, or how you can gain it by matching that posture. What are some other things that we can do in our interactions to build on that, to create rapport? We talked about posture and matching the posture. And again, I can't stress this enough, not mirroring, but matching. Be conscious that if when they're making an effort or a movement, you move to a similar posture. Voice. Now, my feelings won't be hurt. What do you think my challenge is in meeting with a client? What's that?
Volume.
Volume. I get excited about what I do. When I get excited about what I do, I get louder. My challenge is to dial down the volume. And that's because if I'm going in to meet with a client for the first time, not even necessarily the first time, second or third time, and I'm excited about being there, I come in there and there's somebody who has a low volume or a slower talker, I can pick up speed too. And I'm not conscious of what I'm doing, it breaks rapport. Because they're constantly, it's like, turn it down. They can't establish rapport because I've created that barrier there against it. So what I need to do, what you need to do, is be cognizant of the style that the person across the table is using and match theirs. Match their volume, match their voice. Gestures. If you're working with somebody who makes big gestures, a client that makes big gestures, I make big gestures, and you're somebody with elbows in and everything's right here, that can prohibit development of rapport with that person. If I'm in there making big gestures and the person is somebody who's right here and not comfortable outside of this zone, it's going to feel like I'm like this around them. So you need to be cognizant of that. Key words and phrases. If you're from the Northwest and they're from South Carolina and they just naturally say y'all, and you go in there and you start saying y'all, you're going to look stupid. Does anyone here naturally say y'all? Don't do it then. If it's natural, it's okay. But if they're using a key word or a phrase like that, and you're like, well, Brian told me I'll create rapport by using keywords, and you start throwing out a couple of y'alls, it's a challenge for me even to say that because I don't use that term. But if there are key phrases and key words, even technical terms, and I've run into this working across the country, some parts of the country call a storage tank a reservoir. Other parts of the country call a storage tank a tank. And a reservoir to these people is a giant open uncovered lake. A reservoir to me is a 4 million gallon steel or concrete buried reservoir. That's where I store the water. But if they're using the word reservoir to mean this as a tank, then I need to make sure I'm using that same terminology. So it doesn't have to be informal language. It can be technical language as well. It lets that listener know that you're talking about the same thing. Breathing. This is a big one. I have to stop and breathe myself after that. You can tell a lot about where a client is by watching their breathing. And there's two different places your breathing occurs. One is deep down here in the diaphragm, and one is up here, which is shallow breathing. Shallow breathing is associated with the fight or flight response, high anxiety, nervousness. Relaxation, comfort is breathing down here in your stomach, like yoga breathing. Now, you can watch, like Brian is breathing deep right now. He's feeling relaxed. But here's what I want to show you. I want everybody to sit up straight in your chairs. Sorry, Brian. Now, everybody get comfortable. I want you to take 5 long, deep breaths through your mouth. What's your body feel like? Really pay attention to your heart and your chest and what's going on. If you're really in tune with that, your heart started beating faster and your chest tightened up. That's because when you breathe through your mouth, the breathing is high up here in your chest. Now take 5 deep breaths through your nose. Now what did that feel like? That should have brought on a much greater sense of calm and relaxation, and that's because you're breathing down here when you're breathing through your nose deep into your lungs. And that exchanges a lot more oxygen at a slower pace. That's why if you watch a long distance runner who is really trained, they will breathe through their nose because they have trained themselves to do that, because while running you can exchange more oxygen over a broader area in your lungs by breathing through your nose than breathing through your mouth. Now, the same thing can work with a client. If you've got a client who is very relaxed, sitting in their office, listening to your ideas, suddenly starts to go and take a deep breath, that's an indication that something has shifted. And what I just said may not be kosher with the client. And the reason that that's key to pick up on and have an awareness of that type of thing is because the words that come out of the client's mouth will be, yeah, that seems like a good idea to me. Like, oh, if you're aware of it, it's like, oh God, I just stepped in it there. That was a bad idea. But internally, that client's thinking, oh my God, I wish you'd get out of here. That was the stupidest idea I've ever heard in my life. Simply from that change in breathing. It doesn't always indicate it, but it's a tool to be aware of in case you see it. You will see someone's chest moving when they're breathing high, and you'll see their stomach moving when they're breathing low. You want to see when they're in that nice low breathing, you know that you're at a point where you can establish rapport with them. You're trying to establish rapport when somebody's breathing up high isn't going to be a good use of your time. You want to get somebody to a relaxed state. So the reason that's valuable in a business development setting is you don't want to go in there with a bunch of high breathing yourself, because that's going to then create a sense of anxiety and anxiousness on the client's part. You want to go in there feeling calm and confident. And where can you really see this? Where can you put this to work right away with your pursuits? Where can this breathing really impact things? What am I doing now that 97% of the population is terrified of? Public speaking. And when do consultants publicly speak? Interviews. If you go into an interview and you're not prepared, what are you going to do? You're going to breathe up here because you're nervous, because you know you're not prepared. And that's going to come across, and you got a half-hour interview. The first 10 minutes have to result in you bringing it down to where you're getting into it and feeling comfortable. You've just communicated unconsciously to that client that, hey, you know, maybe they're not real confident about what they got going here. So when you can control that breathing and you can breathe deep, that creates relaxation, and you're off and running right from the start. What feedback are you getting back from the client that lets you know that you're in rapport? They seem relaxed? Matching? What else? Think about somebody you've been in rapport with. What's that? Smiling?
The energy level kind of comes up.
The energy level? Yeah. Anybody ever been in one of those meetings where it's just like, this is just an energy vortex. What is going on here? I've been in those meetings. It's like, I got to find some way to get out of this. This is going nowhere. Ease of discussion. That's an indication that you've got rapport. When you get the client asking questions, you've now got the client, through your matching and these other tools of developing rapport, you've got the client in a position where they're asking you questions. That means their heels are no longer dug in. They're not in a defensive posture because you're just the next in a long line of consultants interested in this project. Meetings going long. That's not a bad thing if it's client initiated. So long as you're respectful of their time and it goes with the ease of discussion. It's like, oh wow, we were only scheduled for an hour, but we've been going for an hour and a half. That's okay, so long as you weren't the one doing all the talking. Laughter, smiling. Is there a better indicator of just ease and comfort level and responsiveness than being able to laugh with the client? The client afterwards will take your calls. You know, if you've got a client, you call them and you get the reception, it's like, oh yeah, and he picks up the phone or she picks up the phone. That's a big plus. How many times have you had to call a client back? 2, 3, 4 times. Avoidance is an indication that you don't have rapport. This is a key one. When you've got rapport with a client, they will offer up unsolicited information. You may only ask A and B, they give you C, D, and E. That's gold right there. Another one is insight into the decision process. With someone you don't have rapport with, you ask, well, you know, who might be on the interview team? well, there'll be somebody from this department, somebody from that department, and we haven't decided who over there, and then the utility director. But if you got some rapport with that, it's like, well, it'll be Bob, Jim, and you know Tom, and Sally. You know they will give you insight as to how their decisions are going to be made, simply because you're in rapport. And if you have these things, and you start to get these things from the client, you know you have rapport with the client. And once you have rapport, what do you do with it? Build on it. Yes, build on it. The entire concept behind the Pursuit Coach program and this stuff is it's long-term. It's not single pursuit, boom, here's the pursuit, the RFP's out, let's go. These tools are meant to be applied 12, 18, 24 months out. That's when you build, and I know as consultants, we all get pressure. It's like, what are you doing for me this month? But to a certain point, a certain extent, you have to take your time and know that, yeah, you need to address short-term needs, but you need to lay the groundwork for that long-term. Because if you lay the groundwork for the long-term, what happens when you get out there for that long-term? It's easy, because you've already done all the work up front. My wife was a teacher, and teachers, anybody else know, married to, related to, acquainted with a teacher? What do teachers hate when they start teaching? What do they dread? What takes all their time? It's the lesson planning. If a teacher's teaching that lesson for the first time, she's got to do he or she has to do all the lesson planning for that. It's time consuming. And my wife then, the next semester, gets another class. She's got to start that all over again. But if she does lesson plans for class A here, and then she's teaching class A out here in the future, her prep time now just went from an hour and a half to 4 minutes because of all the work she did back here. And it's the same with business development. You do the work back here, it's already done when you need it out here in the future. Okay, when are you out of rapport? When are you out of rapport? When you're not in rapport. You're either in or you're out. And we all want to be in. And now we know what it looks like to be in rapport. So if you're not getting those signals, what can you do with that? We touched on it a little bit earlier. Find somebody else, or if you're in a meeting testing ideas, and you were in rapport at the start, you opened your mouth, and now you're out of rapport. What can you do with that? Do you keep going? Do you keep talking? No, wrap it back around. If you see that break in rapport, that's your signal to stop, back up, and go with the next idea. Because they don't like this idea. Or you can even stop and say, you don't seem to like that idea. Why is that? Maybe it's because it's the only idea you've got, so you need to modify it. That's a possibility. But it's fine to say that. This isn't meant to be subversive in any way. If you see a break in that rapport, that's a signal to you to check in with the client and say, hey, that didn't seem to quite match with what you were thinking about. What can we do differently, or where was the disconnect? It's a signal to go back and make sure and reestablish that rapport before you move forward again. So once you can identify rapport, or the lack of it, and you know how to create it, you've got a tool in your toolbox to work with clients. So there's clients that you're successful with now, which means what? You have rapport with those clients. Who wants more clients? Have you found yourself wondering, how do I get those new clients? Or have you asked yourself, this is working well here with these clients, what am I doing there that I can do over here? What this whole first part of this presentation was meant to do is to bring this up as an awareness to you. You're probably doing these things in establishing and building and maintaining rapport with your existing good clients. Now you can step back and say, hey, I'm working with ABC, XYZ. This is what I'm doing here. I see those signs, those signals coming back from the clients. I can now take that, and this information helps you codify what you're doing unconsciously, and now take it and apply it to additional clients. Like I said, you don't have to be lifelong friends in order to have rapport. You can maintain and have a business relationship and still have rapport. And if you have rapport, you have what? Influence, and that's what we ultimately want. I just want to reiterate that establishing rapport is the most important thing that you can do to establish long-term success with a client. And again, that's assuming that everyone has the technical expertise already. Because you can have rapport, but if you have no technical expertise, you have no influence either. Rapport and building rapport, use it with sincerity and integrity, or you're going to lose your credibility and trust with the client. Information chunking. In our daily lives, our brains take in more information than we could ever possibly hope to communicate back out to somebody else. You know, you just think of the detail that your eyes and your brain have taken in just in this room here. And to be able to get all that detail back out. You can't do it. It's just impossible. So the technique for addressing that is called information chunking. Now, that is simply finding a starting point and adding more detail or taking detail away in order to get your point across. Now, the direction that you chunk depends on the time you have available, your own interest in the topic, the audience. Where's the audience? Who is the audience? Where do they come from? Your emotional connection with the information. If you're really jazzed up about something, I can keep talking and talking. But if I don't really have that emotional connection and I'm not excited about it, then I'm going to chunk this way down and say, well, yeah, you should all go out there and give better effort and your BD results will come up. And the listener's interest. If I'm given a bunch of detail and people are starting to zone out and just not interested in it, then I need to chunk that information down. I need to be able to take what I have, or you need to be able to take what you have and chunk that information into bits and pieces that are appropriate and sized for the audience. So with that information, you find a point of interaction. And we'll talk more about what that is in a client context. And you either become more general or take detail away, that's chunking up, or you add more detail, and that's called chunking down. A simple example of that would be this. If I say, my front door is blue, that's chunking down, or excuse me, that's chunking up. If I say, my front door is blue, it has a 6-panel design, it had windows across the top, it has a gold knocker, and it has a wreath that really needs to come down since we're already in April, that's chunking in the other direction, giving you more detail. And it depends on where you go, and we'll see how we use that in a BD context. Well, add to that is chunking sideways. So we have chunking up, we have chunking down, and chunking sideways is using the metaphors and analogy that we just talked about. And we'll talk about what that looks like. First, I want to talk about when you chunk up, you become more general, you can create passion by eliminating a lack of interest. And what I mean by that in working with your teams and your staffs, or even yourself or your bosses, if I were to come to you and say, Steve, I want you to do this project according to step 1, step 2, step 3. Now, if I don't know where you fall in that motivation trait, but let's say you fall in those motivation traits where you like it open-ended. Just tell me where I need to go and I'll get there. If I say, I want you to do this by steps 1, 2, and 3, you really have no interest in that. It's like, oh God, procedures, I hate procedures. But if I say, all right, we need $3 million in sales. We need it within this Northwest region, and these are the resources we have available. Go do it. I've now taken steps 1, 2, and 3 in very specifics from down here in more detail, and I've chunked that up and said, here's your goal, here's your resources, You can travel this far, go do it. I've gone up. So by doing that, I've eliminated your lack of interest, and I get the same result. Actually, I get a better result than I hope to get than by giving you the step-by-step procedures. If you go to a team, let's say of younger engineers that are just starting business development, and you say, go win more work. We've seen that maybe when you started your careers and started doing business development too, you can see people just glaze over. It's like, oh my God, what do I do? Do I get the phone book and start making phone calls? I don't know what to do. It's just tremendous sense of overwhelm. And what do people do when they're overwhelmed? They shut down. At worst, they curl up in a fetal position in the corner. It's like, please, don't let them come back by my office. So what you can do there is, an example I have, is you need to create passion. And you can create passion by adding more detail for those people. You can say, okay, we need $3 million in sales. Let's look at what clients we have in this region. Let's now take a look at their CIPs and see what projects they have coming up. Then, what projects can we do? Now, now we've gone from 150 projects down to 20 projects. Let's now make assignments for pursuing and gathering information on these projects so that everybody can go and call. We'll even identify who it is you need to call to gather more information on these projects. And now all those young engineers that are doing BD go, oh, thank God. I know what to do now. It eliminates that overwhelm. And you do that by chunking, adding more detail or taking detail away. Here's a chunking warning for technical professionals. We are educated and we probably have the personality to solve problems. That's what we're doing for a living, is solving problems. Now, one of the issues you need to be aware of is if you jump off this chunking timeline too soon. You probably only need to get verification for that. I know I do, to go talk to my wife, because she wants to give me these long explanations. About halfway through, it's like, here's the solution, let's do it. And 9 times out of 10, probably more like 9.9 times out of 10, I'm wrong. Because what she's ultimately going to get to in need is very different than where I jumped off at the solution point. So we need to find ways to really make sure we're getting information from the client as far down as we can, if we're going in detail, to make sure that we're acting on the right stuff. And the first thing to do is to be aware and identify where the client is. Are they starting in a very general point? Are they in the very nice and neatly in the middle, as I've shown on here? Are they starting out at a point of detail? If you're down here at a point of detail and they're up there talking in generalities, you guys are just two noisy ships passing in the night and there's no communication. So you need to recognize where the client is, meet them there, and then go whatever direction you need to go. If you find the client is down here in the detail area, and there isn't agreement between your solution and their problem, then you need to chunk up and become more general until you can find a point of agreement. I'll give you an example of this. The client's having a problem, and the client says, the current process lacks efficiency. Where are they on this scale? Are they a high level of detail, or are they down here or up there in generalities, or down here in a high level of detail? That's general. As technical people, our first response, well, I can solve that. I can make it more efficient. But you don't know what to make efficient. You don't know what that is. So you need to recognize, if somebody could jump and say, well, that's not efficient, I can solve that. And you're going off spending all kinds of time and money. But if you sit down and ask the client, now let's say the client says this, after you sit down and you've asked the client some questions and gathered some more information, that the response is this: the instrumentation and control programming for Unit 3 is causing excessive chemical addition. Now where are you? That's very specific. You can act on that, and you can give the client what they want in a very concise way, a very efficient way, a very cost-effective way, rather than, well, the plant's inefficient. But if you know that chem feed number 3 isn't working effectively, you know how you can narrow in on a laser focus on how to solve that problem. Looking at this, and when I've presented it before, I had the comments, it's, well, duh, that's just kind of what we do to solve problems. But what I want to get across to you is, you're right, if you're effectively solving problems and working with clients on the scale, that is what you're doing. But what you need to be cognizant of, and I want to talk about, is this learning progression. When we're learning something new, we start down here as unconscious incompetence. That means we don't know what we don't know. That then moves to conscious incompetence, which means we know what we don't know. To conscious competence, which means we know what we know. To unconscious competence, which means we're just kind of going in autopilot. We're so good at what we're doing that we do it without thinking about it. Now, if you're effectively chunking information and solving problems with clients and working them up and down that scale, and you're doing it unconsciously, you need to be able to be aware of that. And I bring this up so you're aware of it, so that you can bring it down and think about what it is you're doing so that you can teach somebody else how to do it. I'm a big fan that if we already know how to do something, teach somebody else how to do it, and don't just leave them out there to flounder and figure it out for themselves. But in order to do that, and you get people that are 20, 25, 30, 35 years into their career, they're on autopilot. And quite often you ask them, well, how do you do that? I don't know. They don't know. So you need to be aware of it so you can come down here to conscious competence and say, all right, this is what I do, codify it, and then be able to teach it to somebody else. Now, an example of this that has just rushed into my life in the last 2 weeks is my oldest son got his driver's permit. But he got his driver's permit, and we're out driving. And if you haven't gone through that before, having to step back after 35 years of driving and now have to think, it's like having an infant behind the wheel. And it's the same thing in business development. When you've done it so long and it's working for you and you're going down that path that's working, you need to be able to back up and say, all right, what is it that I'm really doing? Because once you do that, you can then apply that to that client that you don't yet have. But if you're just moving on and then you go to the next client and you're just doing the same thing, it may or may not work. But if you can codify it over here on what you're doing and being successful, you can then apply it over there. And that's where this chunking is important and why I want to bring that up. Because if you are being successful with clients and you're getting clients what they want and they're happy with you, you're probably doing a good job at chunking that information. So now I just want you to be aware of that so that you can figure out how to do it with somebody else. Chunking laterally. Let's say that you have a process that you go through in doing your proposals, and you always do it this way. That's the way the marketing people say we have to do it. Now, for some reason, there's a block, and you can't do it that way on this proposal or this pursuit. So chunking sideways is where you put that analogy to work. We've done it this way in the past, but using an analogy, you can create, well, doing it that way is kind of like doing it this way. For example, I ran into an issue with an org chart where we had a limited amount of space in a proposal, as we all do, and we needed to get across this information in a meaningful way. And we didn't have space to do a regular org chart because it was a big project, and put the information in there that really explained it and made it useful. So we were at the stopper because we always put in the org chart, we always draw it in its nice neat boxes and lines. So I said, well, if this org chart and this information kind of looks like this, let's try it this way. So what we ended up with, a modified org chart that showed where each one of our team members addressed their 5 primary issues that were all color-coded. So instead of having everybody down so we had a nice hierarchical org chart, This showed their color-coded issues going horizontally, and our staff it still showed who they reported to, but it showed where they were going to be important and where they were going to address the client's needs. So we were able to take an org chart and probably 2.5, 3 pages of explanation and put it into one graphic just by using this process here. We can't do it the way we had before, so let's play with some ideas on how we can do it. We chunked sideways using analogy and metaphor, and then we move forward with it. And the response we had from the clients was they loved it. It was all there, it was all concise, it explained exactly what they needed, far more than just a regular org chart would do. Chunking's pretty straightforward. Is it just problem solving? In a way, it is just problem solving, but it ties together listening, determining where the client is, and then be able to get more general to find agreement and more specific in order to come up with a solution. And don't jump off that chunking bandwagon too soon. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a solution that may have nothing to do with what the client's problem really is. And to have an awareness of that so that you can teach somebody else how to do it. Pacing and leading. Now, envision this. You have a client that needs, for whatever reason, has this boulder in a field that he needs to move. And you see the boulder and he's pushing on it, and you come into the field and you start pushing from the other side. What's going to happen? Nothing. We all know that from physics. But imagine this. Here's our boulder. The client wants it over here. You know, based on your experience and your technical expertise, that it's better off being over here. Pacing and leading isn't about moving the boulder. It's about how you come around to be able to move the boulder. What's the first step in getting this boulder from here to here? You're going to get it rolling. And that's what pacing and leading is all about. Because once it's rolling, with some subtle changes, you can get it going in a different direction. But if you can't get it rolling from the start, then it's just a waste of time. So what are the steps to pacing and leading? First is to establish rapport. And we've talked about that through the language patterns, through matching voice, posture, breathing, gestures, all of that. Now, the next is to pace for agreement. And what this means is once you've established that you have rapport, and in your judgment you have rapport, you can then present an idea and see what the response is from the client. If the client remains in rapport, then you decide, hey, I got something to build on here. You can move on with it. If the client, as I said, breaks rapport with that idea, then you need to back up to step one and reestablish that rapport. Now, if this is a client you have long-term rapport with, you don't have to back up real far. You can outright ask them, hey, what was the problem with this, and move forward. But it's an indication that you need to stop and step back. And then the next step is to lead with affirmations and new ideas. I was skeptical about this myself, but I did try it a few times, like, hey, this works. So I wanted to share it. And this is done by using a statement where the first half of the statement is known to be true by you and the client. And the way the brain works is if that first statement is true, the brain assumes that what follows is also true. So you can put that to your advantage in communicating with clients. And here's some examples. As we continue investigating the problem, you're sitting there, you're investigating the problem, that's a true statement. You can begin to see how our approach provides a solution. Those two things now become linked in the client's mind. I have a problem, the consultant has a solution. As we are watching the presentation, you'll gain an understanding of its value. You're sitting there, you're watching a presentation, that's factual, that's true. So what comes after it is, this is going to have meaning to me. I'm going to understand this. As we are walking through the facility, we can generate new ideas for the technology application. So again, you're walking through the facility with a client. That's factual. That's the brain registers. Says, okay, that's true. I'm not in a swimming pool or someplace else. So what follows that, the brain also assumes to be true, and that you can now generate ideas that will solve their problem. So again, that all becomes linked in the client's mind. And the last one, we may be sitting in here. Let's say you can't get out somewhere. You're in their office and the problem's out at a facility somewhere. We may be sitting here, but we can visualize the benefits of the new application out there. So the client takes that, again, as all true. We're sitting here in the office. That's a true statement. That's obvious. So we'll be able to visualize. I can see how the solution would work out there. These are called pacing and leading statements. But remember, in order for pacing and leading to be effective, you have to have that rapport first. You don't just want to go in there and start throwing out these statements. But if you've established that rapport, you can use these pacing and leading statements to get the client from where he thinks he wants to be to a place that you know he will be better off. Then you certainly want to use those. It's a way to use that to start to nudge this pathway up here. Now, if you have a solution that you know is not in the client's best interest, then no, I would hope you wouldn't be doing this. That would be unethical and you shouldn't do it. If you don't have a good solution, then take yourself out of the running. But if you want to differentiate yourself from the competition, get the client in thinking that between two similar solutions, yours is the best, then by all means, I don't think there's anything wrong with using pacing and leading statements and begin to link that association between the solution or the problem and your solution in their mind. And the reason I believe that, whether it's intentional or unintentional, people that are out there winning work are able to do this, whether they're conscious of, they even know they're doing it or not. So when you go to a client and they've got a problem, there's a continuous stream of consultants that all of a sudden want to know, how they can get in on it and how their solution will work. And the client at that point will just simply dig in their heels. And you get in this standoff. The client doesn't want to give information, the consultant wants information. Let the competition battle that out. You use these pacing and leading statements, and you learn how to get yourself over on the same side of the boulder as the client. And the key is just to get the boulder rolling. When you get the boulder rolling, then you can start to direct it where it is you want to go. It's a subtle practice. You're not going to go out and on Monday put this to work and Friday see benefits. But they're tools and things that you can use for business development. This is our last topic, perceptual positions. Take a good look in the mirror. Walk in someone else's shoes. Being a fly on the wall. Taken individually, they are what they are. But taken together, this really defines what perceptual positions are. Take a look in the mirror, define self. Walk in someone else's shoes is the other person. And fly on the wall is the observer role. Now when you do this, take 3 chairs and put them in a triangular fashion. Sit in that first chair as yourself. That's the first position, the self position. And eyes open, eyes closed, whichever you want. Visualize a meeting that you just had with a client. Get a sense of the feeling you had during that meeting. Was it good? Was it an energy vortex that you just couldn't get anything going? How did you feel? What did you say? It's all about you. The other role is the second position. In the other position, you move to that second chair and you are looking back at yourself. You're in the client's position. And the best that you can, think about what was said, how that meeting went. Was there a lot of energy? How do you think the client felt in that meeting? And then finally, you actually get up, physically move up, and move to that third chair. And from that third chair, you're in the observer position. And that's where I said you're the fly on the wall. You're looking back to see how that interaction was going between these two people. Not yourself and the client. You're an outsider that has just come up, such as going out at lunchtime. You go out at lunchtime, you see two people sitting there, and you don't know who they are, you don't know what they're saying, you don't know what their conversation is. The context is out of it. You're just looking to see how they are relating and interacting in a nonverbal way. This can be used after a meeting to give yourself some insight, hindsight, into how a meeting went. You may think you know how it went, but do it after the fact as well. You can do it before a meeting to practice for an interaction with a client. Go through this, you know what you want to say to the client. Visualize yourself saying those things, say them out loud, and see, once they're out of my head, once I verbalize these thoughts, are they still good thoughts or do they just sound good inside my head? Then move to that client position and try to get a sense of, if I were the client and I heard that, what's my reaction to that going to be? You might think you've got a really great idea, but once you hear it from a client's position, like, whoa, that wasn't so good. And then physically get up and move to that position and do it from the observer position. And it does give you insight into the interaction and how that interaction is going to happen. Someone who functions only in this self position, it's all about them. And an example of the person operating in the self position was that recruiter that called me and talked completely about himself and all the great things he did. And it completely turned me off. I had no interest in talking to him. But he was unable to see this discussion from my position or as an outsider. So if you're always in the self position, it's all about you. And we hear that, you hear that in other business development trainings. You need to make it about the client and how the client is going to benefit. So if you're stuck in the self position and it's all how wonderful I am and how wonderful the firm is, you need to hear that out loud. Next, someone who is in the other position wants to be involved in the other person's business, the other person's interest. I've seen this in consultants that get such a good relationship with a client that they get involved in all the internal workings and the politics of the client's organization. And while you want good rapport with the client, you want to make sure you're outside of that. So you want to make sure you're not operating always in the other position. It's not, you have your needs and your desired outcomes from this interchange. So it's not all about them. It's about balance. And finally, in the observer role, in a BD context, if someone is functioning in the observer role all the time, that's somebody that kind of can be seen as standoffish in the back of the room. And there needs to be a time as a consultant where you got to be able to stand up and say, hey, we're it. We're the solution. We're the best thing out there going. Now, you don't want to do that all the time from the self position, but there comes a time you have to blow your own horn because nobody else is going to blow it for you. By using this and using this technique of moving from the chairs to chairs, you can actually begin to gain a better understanding of what's coming out of your mouth and how you're reacting. Gives you an indication of how the client could react. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to get this down and the client's exactly going to act in the way that you practiced. But it gives you some indication as to how they might react based on what you know. And again, if you have rapport and you know these other things about them, once you hear those words coming out of your mouth, you probably have a pretty good idea of how the client might react to that. And the better you know the client, the more useful this is. And then finally, from the observer role, it's just, you can look, it's like, this guy over here, the consultant, kept talking and talking, but, the client just wasn't listening, the two weren't in rapport. And the observer role is really valuable after the fact, once you've got something to look back on. It is very useful. Here we are, at the end of the day. right back where we started. What we want with our clients is influence. Influence so that they trust us and that we can influence them to select our solution for their project. That's really what we're looking for. And in order to have that, you need technical expertise, so you're competent to do it, and you need the rapport. Minus rapport or minus technical expertise, you have zero influence. And it's this rapport piece that those that are being successful are doing it either consciously or unconsciously, and those that are failing aren't doing it. And if you lose a project and you thought you had rapport with this project, with that client, you probably did, but the other guy just had better rapport with the client. So it's not an all or nothing thing. Rapport builds over time. It builds on itself. So if you lose a project, like, well, I had no rapport with them, so we're never going to chase another project there. If you felt like you had some rapport and you still lost, maybe the other guy just had better rapport. But as I said, if you just felt there was no rapport there, then find somebody who can establish rapport with that client. If you don't have anybody in the firm that can establish rapport with that client, don't spend your time on that client. Time is valuable. Go spend it on another client. Rapport is the dark matter of the BD universe. Like I said at the start, it's everywhere, it surrounds everything, it influences everything. So now, when you leave here, you at least have an awareness that that is out there and what you can do with it. Now, once you've got that, you can take it, you can build on it, and you can be more successful with your clients. Now, is anybody paying attention and see what I just did there? Little pacing and leading statement. I told you already had it. Obviously you accepted that that was true because you have, a good self-image. So now I told you you'll be better at it. See how that works? I would like to leave you with the red hammer story. There was one of these old timers, had the tool belt, the coveralls. He had been working in this factory for 40, 45 years. And new management came on board. Younger management wanted to do things in a different way. And the old timer wasn't outright fired, but he was eased on his way. He has his retirement party, everybody says goodbye, and goes on his way. About 6 months later, there starts to be process problems, production problems in the plant. The new management says, go out and fix this. So internal staff tries to fix it, tries to find the problem. They come back and say, I think we need to hire a consultant. So all right, they go out and hire a consultant. Consultant comes in, does a study, comes up with some recommendations. None of them really work. Problem still isn't solved. Management says, our production numbers are dropping. We need to get this fixed. How can we do this? Somebody sitting in the back of the room says, why don't we call the old engineer? He seems to know this place better than anybody else. So the new management, kind of grumbles, checks their egos and puts their tail between their legs and calls the old engineer and says, we've got a problem here. Can you come and help us find out what it is? And the engineer says, yeah, sure, I can do that. So he straps on his tool belt. He comes into the factory, spends a whole day walking around, feeling pipes, flicking dials and meters, and adjusting things, and walks to the far back corner of the factory, pulls out his red hammer, taps on the valve, and everything goes and operates and hums beautifully. Old engineer says, there you go, problem solved. So then he goes home, and about 2 weeks later, new management gets a bill for $50,000. They said, what's this for? He brought his own lunch. He was here for 8 hours, and all he did was tap on a valve. What's this bill for $50,000 for? Find out what this is all about. So they call up the old engineer, and they said, what's this bill for? How can you justify a bill for $50,000 for solving this problem? And the engineer says, I charged you $5,000 for tapping on the valve. And I said, well, what's the other $45,000 for? And he said, for knowing where to tap. Now with these skills and building rapport with your clients, it gives you a better understanding of knowing where to tap. It cuts out a lot of the unknowns, and it takes you right to where you need to go to really engage with your clients and get the best results for them, and most importantly, in your professional careers, for you. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Have a safe day.